Hello, my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and I am back with 10 Tales of Christmas. And this is a very old collection of Christmas stories. And some of them are happy, and some of them are sad, and some of them are a little strange. Not what we hear as children very much today, but these were Christmas tales written long ago. And this one is called Cosette's Christmas, and it was written by Victor Hugo, who is a very famous author, in 1956, which was before Grandma Carla was born. And this one is a tale about Cosette, a little orphan girl, and she is a servant in the Thénardier's tavern, and they abuse her and make her life miserable. So part of this story will be very sad. But let's see what it says. One Christmas evening, several men, wagon drivers and peddlers, were seated at table and drinking around 4 or 5 candles in the low hall of the Thénardier Inn. This room resembled all taverns. Tables, pewter mugs, bottles, drinkers, smokers, little light, and much noise. The date was 1823. And that, however, indicated by the 2 things then in style in middle-class families. On the table were a kaleidoscope and a fluted tin lamp. Thénardier, the wife, was looking to the supper, which was cooking before a bright, blazing fire. The husband, Thénardier, was drinking with his guest and talking politics. Cosette was at her usual place, seated on the crosspiece of the kitchen table near the fireplace. She was clad in rags. Her bare feet were in wooden shoes, and by the light of the fire she was knitting woolen stockings for the little Thénardiers. Cosette was musing sadly, for though she was only 8 years old, she had hardly suffered so much that she mused with the mournful air of an old woman. Cosette was then thinking that it was evening, late in the evening, that the bowls and pitchers in the rooms of the travelers who had arrived must be filled immediately, and that there was no more water in the cistern. Mrs. Thénardier raised the little cover of a kettle, which was boiling on the range, then took a glass and hastily approached the cistern. She turned the faucet. The child had raised her head and followed all her movements. A thin stream of water ran from the faucet and filled the glass half full. "Here," said she, "there is no more water." Then she was silent for a moment. The child held her breath. Mrs. Thénardier threw the street door wide open. "Well, go after some." Cosette hung her head and went for an empty bucket that was by the chimney corner. The bucket was larger than she, and the child could have sat down on it comfortably. Mrs. Thénardier went back to her range and tasted what was in the kettle with a wooden spoon, grumbling all the while. "There is some at the spring. She is the worst girl that ever was. I think 'twould have been better if I'd left out the onions." Then she fumbled in a drawer where there were some pennies, pepper, and garlic. "Here, Mam'selle Toad," added she, "get a big loaf at the baker's as you come back. Here is 15 sous. Cosette had a little pocket in the side of her apron. She took the piece without saying a word and put it in that pocket. Then she remained motionless, bucket in hand, the open door before her. She seemed to be waiting for somebody to come to her aid. "Get along," cried Mrs. Thénardier. Cosette went out, and the door closed. There was a fair in the village with all sorts of booths. The last of these stalls, set up exactly opposite Thénardier's door, was a toy shop, all glittering with trinkets, glass beads, and magnificent things in tin. In the first row, right in front, the merchant had placed upon a bed of white napkins a great doll nearly 2 feet high, wearing a dress of pink crepe. It had golden birds on its head and real hair and enamel eyes. At the moment when Cosette went out, bucket in hand, all gloomy and overwhelmed as she was, she could not help raising her eyes toward this wonderful doll, toward the lady, as she called it. The poor child stopped petrified. She had not seen this doll so near before. This whole booth seemed a palace to her. This doll was not a doll, it was a vision. She gazed upon this beautiful pink dress, this beautiful smooth hair, and she was thinking how happy that doll must be. In this adoration, she forgot everything, even the errand on which she had been sent, for you remember she was only 8. Suddenly, the harsh voice of Mrs. Thénardier called her back to reality. "How, Jade, haven't you gone yet? Hold on, I am coming for you. I'd like to know what she's doing there. Little monster, be off!" Mrs. Thénardier had glanced into the street and perceived Cosette in ecstasy. Cosette fled with her bucket, running as fast as she could. As the Thénardier tavern was in that part of the village which is near the church, Cosette had to go to the spring in the woods towards Shells to draw water. The further she went, the thicker became the darkness. There was no longer anybody in the street. She ran out of the village. She ran into the woods, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. She did not stop running until she was out of breath, and even then she staggered on. She went right on, desperate. Thus she arrived at the spring. Cosette did not take time to breathe. It was very dark, but she was accustomed to coming to this fountain. She bent down and plunged the bucket in the water. She was, for a moment, so excited that her strength tripled. When she was thus bent over, she did not notice that the pocket of her apron emptied itself into the spring. The 15 sous piece fell into the water. Cosette neither saw it nor heard it fall. She drew out the bucket almost full and set it on the grass. She grasped the handle with both hands. She could hardly lift the bucket. After resting a few seconds, she started on. Arriving near an old chestnut tree, which she knew, she made at last, longer than the others, to get well rested. Then she gathered all her strength, took up the bucket again, and began to walk courageously. Meanwhile, the poor little despairing thing could not help crying, "Oh, my God, my God." At that moment, she felt all at once that the weight of the bucket was gone. A hand, which seemed enormous to her, had just caught the handle and was carrying it easily. She raised her head. A large, dark form, straight and erect, was walking beside her in the gloom. It was a man who had come up behind her and whom she had not heard. This man, without saying a word, had grasped the handle of the bucket she was carrying. "What is your name?" said the man. "Cosette." "Who is it that has sent you out into the woods after water at this time of night?" "Madame Thénardier." "What does she do, your Madame Thénardier?" "She is my mistress," said the child. "She keeps the tavern." "The tavern," said the man. "Well, I am going there to lodge tonight. Show me the way." As they drew near the tavern, Cosette timidly touched his arm. "Monsieur?" "What, my child?" "Here we are, close by the house." "Well?" "Will you let me take the bucket now?" "What for?" "Because if Madame sees that anybody brought it for me, she will beat me." The man gave her the bucket. A moment after, they were at the door of the chop house. "Madame," said Cosette, trembling, "here is a gentleman who is coming to lodge." "Oh, my brave man, I'm very sorry, but I have no room." Put me where you will, said the man, in the garret in the stable. I will pay as if I had a room. 40 sous? 40 sous. Well, in advance, 40 sous, whispered the wagon driver to Mrs. Thenardier, but it is only 20 sous. It is 40 sous for him, replied Mrs. Thenardier in the same tone. I don't lodge poor people for less. That's true, added the husband softly. It ruins a house to have this sort of people. Meanwhile, the man, after leaving his stick and bundle on a bench, had seated himself at a table on which Cosette had been quick to place a bottle of wine and a glass. Suddenly, Mrs. Thenardier exclaimed, "Oh, I forgot the bread." Cosette, according to her custom whenever Mrs. Thenardier raised her voice, sprang out quickly from under the table. She had entirely forgotten the bread. She acted as do children who are always terrified. She lied. "Madame, the baker was closed." "You ought to have knocked." "I did knock, madame." "Well, he didn't open." "I'll find out tomorrow if that is true," said Mrs. Thenardier. "And if you are lying, you will lead a pretty dance. Meantime, give me back the pennies, the 15 sous pieces." Cosette plunged her hand into her apron pocket and turned white. The 15 sous piece was not there. "Come," said the woman. "Didn't you hear me?" Cosette turned her pocket inside out. There was nothing there. What could have become of that money? The little unfortunate could not utter a word. She was petrified. "Have you lost it, the 15 sous piece?" she screamed the woman. "Or do you want to steal it from me?" At the same time, she reached her arm toward the cowhide whip hanging in the chimney corner. This menacing movement gave Cosette the strength to cry out, "Forgive me, madame! Madame, I won't do it any more." The woman took down the whip. Meanwhile, the man in the yellow coat had been fumbling in his waistcoat pocket without being noticed. The other travelers were drinking or playing cards, and he paid no attention to anything. Cosette was writhing with anguish in the chimney corner, trying to gather up and hide her poor half-naked limbs. Mrs. Thenardier raised her arm. "I beg your pardon, madame," said the man, "but I just now saw something fall out of the pocket of that little girl's apron and roll away. That may be it." At the same time, he stooped down and appeared to search on the floor for an instant. "Just so. Here it is," he said, rising. And he handed a silver piece to the woman. "Yes, that is it," said she. That was not it, for it was a 20 sous piece, but Mrs. Thenardier found her profit in it. She put the piece in her pocket and contented herself with casting a ferocious look at the child and saying, "Don't let this happen again, ever." Cosette went back to what Mrs. Thenardier called her hole, and her large eyes, fixed upon the unknown traveler, began to assume an expression that they had never known before. It was still only an artless astonishment, but a sort of blind confidence was associated with it. A door now opened, and Éponine and Alcima walked in. They were really two pretty little girls, rather city girls than peasants, very charming, one with her well-polished auburn tresses, the other with her long black braids falling down on her back, and both so lively, neat, plump, fresh, and healthy, that it was a pleasure to see them. They went and sat down by the fire. They had a doll, which they turned backward and forward upon their knees with many pretty prattlings. From time to time, Cosette raised her eyes from her knitting, then looked sadly at them as they were playing. Éponine and Alcima did not notice Cosette. To them, she was like the dog. The doll of the Thenardier sisters was very much faded and very old and broken, but it appeared none the less wonderful to Cosette, who had never in her life had a doll, a real doll. Cosette had left her knitting, but she had not moved from her place. Cosette always stirred as little as possible. She had taken from a little box behind her a few old rags and her little lead sword. Eponine and Elsima paid no attention to what was going on. They had just performed a very important operation. They had caught the kitten. They had thrown the doll on the floor. While Eponine and Elsima were dressing up the cat, Cosette, for her part, had dressed up the sword. That done, she had laid it upon her arm and was singing it softly to sleep. All at once, Cosette stopped. She had just turned and seen the little Thenardier doll, which they had forsaken for the cat and left on the floor a few steps from the kitchen table. Then she let the bundled up sword, which only half satisfied her, fall and ran her eyes slowly around the room. Mrs. Thenardier was whispering to her husband and counting some money. Eponine and Elsima were playing with the cat. The travelers were eating and drinking and singing. Nobody was looking at her. She had not a moment to lose. She crept out from under the table on her hands and knees, made sure once more that nobody was watching. Then she darted quickly to the doll and seized her. An instant afterwards, she was in her place, seated, motionless, only turned it such a way as to keep the doll that she held in her arms in the shadow. Nobody had seen her except the traveler, who was slowly eating his meager supper. This joy lasted for nearly a quarter of an hour. But in spite of Cosette's precautions, she did not perceive that one of the dolly's feet stuck out, and that the fire in the fireplace lighted it up vividly. This rosy and luminous foot, which protruded from the shadows, suddenly caught Elsima's eye, and she said to Eponine, "Oh, sister!" The two little girls stopped, stupefied. Cosette had dared to take the doll. Eponine got up and, without letting go of the cat, went to her mother and began to pull on her skirt. "Let me alone," said her mother. "What do you want?" "Mother," said the child, "look there." And she pointed at Cosette. Cosette, wholly absorbed in the ecstasy of her possession, saw and heard nothing else. "Cosette!" Cosette shuddered as if the earth had quaked beneath her. She turned around. "Cosette!" repeated Mrs. Thenardier. Cosette took the doll and placed it gently on the floor. With a kind of veneration mingled with despair, she sobbed. Meanwhile, the traveler rose. "What is the matter?" he asked. "Don't you see?" answered the woman. "Well, what is that?" said the man. "That beggar has dared to touch the children's doll." "Well, what if she did play with that doll?" "She has touched it with her dirty hands," continued Mrs. Thenardier, "with her horrible hands." Here Cosette redoubled her sobs. "Be still," cried the woman. The man walked straight to the street door, opened it, and went out. As soon as he was gone, Mrs. Thenardier profited by his absence to give Cosette under the table a severe kick, which made the child shriek. The door opened again, and the man reappeared, holding in his hands the fabulous doll of which she had spoken, and which had been the admiration of all the youngsters of the village since morning. He stood it up before Cosette, saying, "Here, this is for you." Cosette raised her eyes. She saw the man approach her with the doll as she would have seen the sun approach. She heard those astounding words, "This is for you." She looked at him. She looked at the doll. Then she drew back slowly and went and hid as far as she could under the table in the corner of the room. She wept no more. She cried no more. She had the appearance of no longer daring to breathe. Mrs. Thenardier, Eponine, and Elsima were very much statues. Even the drinkers stopped. There was a solemn silence in the whole room. Cosette looked upon the wonderful doll with a sort of terror. It seemed to her that if she touched that doll, thunder would spring forth from it, which was true to some extent, for she thought that Mrs. Thenardier would scold and beat her. However, the attraction overcame her. She finally approached and timidly murmured, turning towards Mrs. Thénardier, "Can I, madame?" "Good Lord," said the woman, "it is yours, since Monsieur gives it to you." "Is it true? Is it true, Monsieur?" Cosette asked. "Is the lady for me?" The stranger appeared to have his eyes full of tears. He nodded assent to Cosette and put the hand of the lady in her little hand. "I will call her Catherine," she said. It was Éponine and Alcimar now who looked upon Cosette with envy. Cosette went to bed, holding Catherine in her arms. Several hours passed away. The midnight mass was said. The revel was finished. The drinkers had gone. The house was closed. The rooms were deserted. The fire had gone out. The stranger still remained in the same place and in the same posture. The innkeeper retired to his room. His wife was in bed, but not asleep. When she heard her husband's step, she turned toward him and said, "You know that I'm going to kick Cosette outdoors tomorrow." For his part, the traveler had put his staff and bundle in a corner. The host gone, he sat down in his armchair, and there he remained for some time thinking. Then he drew off his shoes and went out of the room, looking about him as if he were searching for something. He passed through the hall and came to the stairway. There he heard a very soft little sound, which resembled the breathing of a child. There, among all sorts of old baskets and old rubbish, in the dust and among the cobwebs, there was a little bed. If a mattress so full of holes as to show the straw, and a covering so full of holes as to show the mattress, can be called a bed. There were no sheets. This was placed on a floor immediately on the tiles. In this bed, Cosette was sleeping. The man approached and looked at her. Cosette was sleeping soundly. She was dressed. In the winter, she did not undress on account of the cold. She held the doll clasped in her arms. On the following morning, at least 2 hours before day, Thénardier, seated at a table in the bar room, a candle by his side with pen in hand, was making out the bill of the traveler in the yellow coat. His wife was standing, half bent over him, following with her eyes. "You don't forget that I kicked Cosette out of the house today. The monster! It tears me apart to see her with that doll." Thénardier lighted his pipe and answered between two puffs, "You'll give the bill to the man." Then he went out. He was scarcely out of the room when the traveler came in. Mrs. Thénardier handed him the folded bill. The man unfolded the paper and looked at it, but his thoughts were evidently elsewhere. "Madame," replied he, "do you do a good business in Montfermeil?" So, monsieur," answered Mrs. Thénardier, stupefied at seeing no other explosion. She continued in a mournful and lamenting train, "Oh, monsieur, the times are very hard, and then we have so few rich people around here. It is very little place, you see. If we only had rich travelers now and then, like monsieur. We have so many expenses. Why, that little girl eats us out of house and home." "What little girl?" "Why, the little girl you know, Cosette. Suppose you were relieved of her." "Who, Cosette?" "Yes." "Ah, monsieur, my good monsieur, take her, keep her, take her away. Carry her off, sugar her, stuff her, drink her, eat her, and be blessed by the Holy Virgin and all the saints in paradise." "Agreed." "Really? You will take her away?" "I will." "Immediately?" "Immediately. Call the child." "Cosette!" cried the woman. "In the meantime," continued the man, "I will pay my bill. How much is it?" He cast a glance at the bill and could not repress a movement of surprise. 23 francs? He looked at the hostess and repeated, 23 francs? Mrs. Thénardier had had time to prepare herself for the shock. She replied with assurance, "Yes, of course, monsieur. It is 23 francs. The stranger placed 5 5-franc pieces upon the table. "Go for the little girl," said he. At this moment, Thénardier advanced in the middle of the room and said, "Monsieur owes 26 sous." "26 sous?" exclaimed the woman. 20 sous for the room, Thenardier coldly, and 6 for supper. As to the little girl, I must have some talk with Monsieur about it. Leave us, wife. Thenardier continued, "How strangely we become attached. What is all this silver? Take back your money. This child I adore." "Who is that?" asked the stranger. "Oh, our little Cosette. Pardon me, excuse me, monsieur, but one does not give his child like that to a traveler. I do not know even your name. I must at least see some poor rag of paper, a bit of passport, something." The stranger, without removing from him this gaze which went, so to speak, to the bottom of his conscience, answered in a severe and firm tone, "Monsieur Thenardier, people do not take a passport to come 5 leagues from Paris. If I take Cosette, I take her. That is all. You will not know my name. You will not know my abode. You will not know where she goes. And my intention is that she shall never see you again in her life. Do you agree to that, yes or no?" "Monsieur," said he, "I must have 1,500 francs. The stranger took from his side pocket an old black leather pocketbook, opened it, and drew forth 3 blank bills, which he placed upon the table. He then rested his large thumb on these bills and said to the tavern keeper, "Bring Cosette." The day was breaking when those of the inhabitants of Montfermeil who were beginning to open their doors saw pass on the road to Paris a poorly clad good man leading a little girl dressed in mourning, who had a pink doll in her arms. It was the stranger and Cosette. Cosette walked seriously along, opening her large eyes and looking at the sky. From time to time, she looked at the good man. She felt somewhat as if she were very near God. Written by Victor Hugo. So, the good man, the stranger, paid money so that he could take the little beggar girl away to live with him and be taken care of. And I'm sure that he took good care of her as he gave her that little doll when he didn't know anything about her, and then paid money to the wicked woman who at first was going to throw her outside that day, but then decided that she wanted some money for Cosette after all. So that was a sad little story that ended very nicely with Cosette getting a home with the stranger. And she thought he must be very like God. Wasn't that a sweet story? This is Grandma Carla, and I love you.